I'm excited to hear you all. Boy, you are first thing in the morning. Here we go. Welcome to Ebertfest 25th. Great films last night, and great film and a tribute last night, and we will continue that throughout the weekend. And these panels are a really important part of us being able to engage folks in the community. So I'm happy to moderate this panel. We're going to be talking about a couple of things. One, the film Girlhood, which is going to be screening tomorrow, which is sponsored by the Alliance for the Promotion of Acceptance and Respect. I want to make sure to get that right. And so what I'd like to do today is to bring the issues to the forefront in terms of why an organization like this is needed and the work, and then to talk about the role the arts can play in of that particular organization and of all of us about these issues. So what I'm going to do is ask people to introduce themselves. What we have is professionals who work in the area of inclusion and acceptance, and then we have critics who get to talk about film and things of that nature. So hopefully we can blend that conversation together. So I'm going to have some questions for them, and then the last 15, 20 minutes or so, take the opportunity to ask questions from the audience. So if you have a question along the way, jot it down at that point in the panel, you'll be able to ask your questions. So I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Eric Pierson. I am a professor at the University of San Diego, also an of the University of Illinois, and have been part of the festival going all the way back to 1999, and I love to come back and come home and be a part of this particular experience. So, and I also talk a little bit about the way in which being here at the U of I has really helped to make me a more accepting person when it comes to issues of disability and how we integrate those folks into our lives. So, Sheila, we'll start with you.
I'm Sheila O'Malley, and I am a contributor to RogerEbert.com.
I'm Elaine Spunkin. I'm the director of the Psychological Services Center on campus, and we also have a conflict clinic there where we do restorative justice circles in the Juvenile Detention Center and in the community. If you maybe read about the News Gazette article about the circle that happened after the Centennial incident, that was our team.
Matt Zoller-Seitz. I'm the editor-in-chief of RogerEbert.com, TV critic for New York Magazine, and the author of some film books, including the Wes Anderson collection.
I can't follow that very well. I'm Joe Mosagi. I'm a counselor at Parkland College. Over the years, I've worked in health center, service center, and now at Parkland, we've seen a lot of students who have many of these unseen disabilities, and so integrate them into our community.
My name is Omar Mozaffar. I'm also a contributor for RogerEbert.com. I'm one of Roger's far-flung correspondents, and I'm also the Muslim chaplain at Loyola University back in Chicago.
Oh, cool. What I'd like to do first is ask Elaine and Joseph and even Omar in your role as chaplain to sort of talk about the issue of acceptance and inclusion and sort of integration of folks into the mainstream, so to speak, and what what organizations are doing and sort of what the conversation is right now. So if you could do that.
Yeah, thanks. I think for those of you who are fortunate enough to see the movie this week, it really deals a lot in my issues of belonging, dignity, respect, inclusion. So it's a really great fit for the kind of work we're trying to do in this community. And for a lot of young people who are marginalized, the issue of dignity and respect is really forefront. And a lot of conflict that we see in our community and in families if you dig a little bit and if you let young people's voices come forward, you'll find out that at the bottom of it, they want more respect and more dignity and more acceptance for who they are. And I think the film deals with it also in the issue of double binds. So a lot of young people of color or immigrants, LGBT youth, or in this case, they're who are also immigrants, who are also girls of color, experience a lot of double binds. So a double bind might be, you're supposed to be sexy and alluring, but also pure and don't fool around. You're supposed to be very independent and strong and stand up for yourself and fight for yourself, and you're supposed to obey men and don't speak up. So I think a lot of these kind of underlying issues is what the organizations in town try to work on when we work with youth. Because if you don't go underneath to those underlying issues of dignity, respect, and double binds, you're just scratching the surface and you're trying to fix things that, you know, on top, instead of going to the roots underneath. And I think the movie really deals with those issues really well.
As a councilor at Parkland, I mean, one of the things that we get to deal with, we have a lot of immigrants in this community. We have a lot of, the Congolese community in this town is huge. And the average Congolese immigrant in this community is a professional and speaks probably 3 to 4, maybe 5 languages. And getting them integrated into not just the academic community, but into the community at large is difficult. I mean, and then many of them have children, and the children have to be integrated. Many of the children get integrated a little easier, but when they go home, they still remain Congolese. And so they speak English fluently, but when they go home, they speak Lingala or French. Many of them are very fluent in French. One of the things that I always encourage my other counselors and advisors to do is to think about these many professionals, because we have quite a few Congolese doctors here who cannot practice, Congolese nurses who cannot practice, deal with them as professionals, because yes, they're students now, but they're professionals who have deep understanding of a lot of things that I don't even understand. And then going into the mental health field, as immigrants, a lot of times we don't talk about mental health. We don't talk about autism. We don't talk about disabilities, especially those disabilities seen. And so how do you deal with the issue that, okay, I know I don't feel 100%. Everybody tells me and that's what the community they're in is saying, but then the larger community around them says, maybe you ought to talk about this, but you don't talk about this with family. And so that double bind, as Elaine was talking about, it pulls at them. And so having someone at Parkland and having the people in the community who understand immigration issues has been helpful for quite a few of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, building on both of these points, I think our society is very strong in making institutions. I think it's also very aggressive in creating a mythology. And if you don't fit it within the mythology, then it's as though something's wrong with you. And the further you are away from that mythology, that narrative of the alpha male, for example, then you're conditioned to think very often that, okay, you're the problem. The mythology is not the problem. And so in terms of dignity, there's this idea, where does a person get validation from? And so that becomes part of our work, that you find your inherent dignity in being a person. And then on top of that, this, when working with immigrants, I think a very important point is that our culture is very much a guilt-oriented culture, where many cultures are shame cultures, where you're just afraid to talk because you're going to disgrace everyone. I think these are wonderful points. Yeah.
So you talked about the mythology. I wanted to continue that strand and bring in the other critics. What is the role in the arts, particularly film, in perhaps helping us to work through some challenges to that mythology that you're talking about? So.
Well, I think just speaking about art in general, art, we say is a mirror to society, or art is the artist showing us things that we may not see. And I think art is very, very effective in allowing someone to see a narrative in the comfort of their home or in the movie theater, and then embracing humanity through that, right? Something we would be afraid of otherwise, something we might find repulsive otherwise, is someone who is just as human with a beating heart like the rest of us. I think it can be very, very strong.
Okay. Would the others like to comment on that as well?
I was thinking about this on the plane on the way out here. I've been a critic for, I guess, almost 25 years, and during that time, I think my consciousness has evolved a lot. I'm aware of things that I didn't used to be aware of, and when I look back on some of the wrote early on, I'm amazed by how not aware I was of any of the things that we're discussing on this panel. And Omer talked about art as a mirror. That's a really tricky phrase for me, because I think that I think a lot of people to mean that art is showing you more or less exactly what society is at that moment, and we should all look at it and recognize it and be okay with it. And if we don't necessarily look exactly like the picture in that mirror, we should strive to translate it into an image that we can appreciate. But if the image that you see in the mirror is that of a white guy like me, I'm almost never on the other end of that as a moviegoer. I'm just not. I mean, most of the stories, and there are actually statistical studies that have been done on this. The majority of Hollywood films, period, the main character is a white man. Almost always hetero. Well, great, yay me. But it doesn't do a whole lot. Don't fit one or more of those descriptors, and the fact that it doesn't usually work the other way is an issue that I don't know. I'm not entirely sure how to get around. Roger Ebert, who founded this festival and the website that I'm now an editor of, had the right idea when he talked about it as a machine that generates empathy, and he was always really adamant about movies as a projection mechanism where you don't have to necessarily fit all of the descriptors of the protagonist of the film in order to see your. And he was really good at identifying a movie like Children of Heaven or Killer of Sheep or E.T. all had something in common, you know. But there's not a whole lot of that right now, I don't think. I feel like things are getting better in that respect, but there's a difference between what idealism that we hold as viewers and how audiences actually go to the movies. And I'm not sure how to bridge that gap.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm as an immigrant also, one of the things that I know I do not see myself on the screen. I do not hear myself. And bringing up two young men also, they do not see themselves on the screen either. And looking for those heroes that reflect you is almost, it's an anomaly. I mean, and so talking to them, one of the things I really, in order to teach empathy, you've got to have that conversation. You can't just watch a movie. And I think one of the things that we try to do with our kids is have that conversation constantly. You watch a movie, let's talk about it. You read a book, let's talk about it. What do you think this guy was really trying to say? What does it mean? And so just having that conversation with people and also challenging that also, challenging people who make movies to hopefully make a reflection of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't matter. That's the thing that I keep saying whenever I discuss this issue with people is ultimately it shouldn't matter if you have something outwardly in common with the protagonist of a story. We should all be able to translate ourselves into a point where we can kind of meet them halfway. But it doesn't often, people aren't usually challenged in that way. Like if you don't usually lift heavy objects on the day that arrives that you have to help a friend move their furniture out of hurts.
Yeah.
You know, you get muscle strain, and I think that happens imaginatively as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's kind of interesting considering the film that we'll all be seeing tomorrow. and I think about that Roger quote all the time in movies, that it's a machine that potentially can generate empathy. You know, when Girlhood came out, there was, because the Boyhood last year was like the year of Boyhood, there was all this like, is this the French, you know, is this the boy? It was like it was an assumption that the male was the default, and that the girlhood would somehow be commenting on it or an offshoot of it, or it's not that at all. It's its own. And if I can go, this is just me personally, if I can go and see myself in that young boy in Boyhood, then I would hope that boys could watch the girls in Girlhood and go, oh, okay, either I remember that from my adolescence, or I never thought about that with girls. I never thought that maybe these things were, and that's what Roger really was talking about, is those challenges to maybe how we conceive people based on what they look like, whatever. Those are the most exciting moments for me when I go to the movies, when I have a moment of like, oh God, I never even thought about this issue. You know, it can change how you look at other people.
And I really love the idea of art as a start for dialogue. And so, like, what you guys are doing here is that you're engaging in dialogue with us, or will be, and this is a dialogue about art. And I know that when I used to read Roger's, what are they called? Reviews, thank you. Critiques, because they felt like not critiques to me, and my partner and I always said, like, wow, this is the beginning of dialogue. A great review is dialogue. It's the first step.
His review of a Spike Lee movie, I don't want to jump in, but there's a quote that I quote all the time, and it's from his review of the Spike Lee movie School Days. And I read this when I was a college student. I was a 19, 20-year-old college review, and it began something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like, School Days is the first, or he was referring to his review, Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee's, or I'm sorry, She's Gotta Have It, Spike Lee's first film, but he said it was the first film he'd seen in a very long time where the black characters on screen seemed to be relating to each other rather than to a hypothetical white audience.
Right.
And I never thought about it that way before, because I was a young white man. It didn't occur to me that the vast majority of movies that I went to see were talking directly to me as a young white man, and that a movie like that's about a protagonist of color feels the need to have a mediator. And that, I was also thinking on the plane on something that's sort of related, is years and years ago, there's a wonderful movie which I would be stunned if anyone else in this room had seen, called Puzzlehead. It was a low-budget Frankenstein movie that was made in Brooklyn, and the director was James Bai, an Asian American, who later became a friend of mine. And it retold the Frankenstein myth. It's really an excellent, excellent film, but all the actors are white. And I did an interview with him, and one of the interview commented, "Why? I'm curious. You're an Asian American. Why did you cast your movie with all white people?" And he said, "Because if I cast it with an entirely Asian American cast, now the movie becomes a movie about the Asian experience."
Yeah.
And I didn't want it to be that. I wanted about these more general issues, and that's why I cast white people in it. And this argument raged in the comments section under this interview that I did with James about whether or not inadvertently being part of the problem by casting white people in his movie, despite the Asian. He's saying, wouldn't it be better if you cast Asian Americans, and then you have that discussion of why is it that when I cast Asian Americans in a movie, that suddenly it becomes a movie about the Asian experience rather than a Frankenstein story. And he said, because I don't want to do that, because I want it to be a Frankenstein story. And it's something that he struggled with, and I'm sure that there are a lot of filmmakers who don't fit the default white straight male description who struggle with that as well. I wonder if Spike Lee struggled with that when he remade Old Boy, you know, which was originally a South Korean film with a South Korean actor. Everybody in the movie is South Korean, and Spike Lee remakes it and he casts a white guy, Josh Brolin, as the lead. And Spike has directed movies with all kinds of different people of different ethnicities and races. But I wonder if he thought about that. Like, if I cast a black actor in this lead role, does it become the story of a black man? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there is that idea that if you're not the default, then you're struggling to be like the default. And I get interviewed over and over again about the struggles to be American, the struggles to be accepted in society. And I didn't know there was a struggle growing up. Nobody told me in my house. Yeah.
I mean, I always say I did not know I was black till I got to America. I mean, and going back to school days, I mean, I own the movie School Days. My kids haven't seen it yet, but it's a movie I would watch with them because that would be one of the first movies that they would see all the characters like them.
You mentioned dialogue. So we're having this dialogue here. We're going to see Girlhood tomorrow. So how do we continue the dialogue, right? So the dialogue isn't isolated within this weekend, and the message and the conversation gets to move beyond Champaign-Urbana. So how do we do that? How do we facilitate that to make sure that that happens?
I think that's where the critics come in, right? That our job is to really get people to talk in our own capacities, to raise ideas, to raise issues at the films themselves, to challenge the films, to challenge each other. I mean, that's one aspect.
Yeah, and I think I would broaden that to say all of you hold a piece of that answer after you see a movie, a Disney movie with a little girl with a waist like this, or a heroine who's helpless and is saved. I mean, whatever it might be, you get to turn to your seat partner or sister or husband and say, wow, I want to talk about that. Or to your kids, the critics are a piece of the dialogue. The mental health professionals are a piece of the dialogue. And audience is not a passive container. This is how I think this is how we continue it, is you get angry or excited, and you go home and you call up, I saw this movie and I'm really offended, or I'm really excited. And there are lots of, I think, forks in this movie that you're going to see tomorrow. Forks, decision points for these girls. And they made decisions, they made choices that I think are really interesting places for dialogue. She made this choice and what led her to it, and let's talk about that with my teenager or my
I mean, I mean, as a teacher also, one of the things I do in my classroom constantly is have a Socratic dialogue, throw out questions that I really don't even know the answer to, or even don't want to know the answer to, but how do you continue this conversation? When you talk about or watch something, why not have a deeper conversation about it? Because I mean, I don't be a passive observer of a movie. When I go to hear music, I don't just want to hear music. I want to dance, I want to play, I want to do things. So when I go to a movie, I want to have that conversation with people around me. Say, what did you think about that? Man, I think that really, as the kids would say, sucked. And ways in which we have that larger conversation as opposed to just say, oh, that was good. Oh, I didn't like that.
Well, and also as a critic, it was some point, I don't remember, it was many, many years ago, I decided that I was never going to mention the race or the gender of anyone in a review ever again unless it was absolutely integral to the themes or the plot of the film. So you know, in other words, if the cast is predominantly white and there's an African American character, I won't say, you know, Fred, the African American cab driver.
right.
And he was on the screen
why
for
would
2
I
minutes.
do that?
Indian guy.
And it's posed some challenges, like to the point where sometimes it seems like more trouble than it's worth. But I did a profile recently of the television director Michelle McLaren, and every profile that I had seen of her included a section where she talked about how difficult it was to be a woman in a man's business. And my editor said, you should ask her about being a woman in a male-dominated industry. And I said, okay, I really wish I didn't have to do that, but I'll do it. And I'll never forget interviewing her, and we were walking through some park in Los Angeles, and I asked her about that. She said, boy, I really wish this didn't have to be in the story. And I said, well, maybe it doesn't, and I'll see what I can do with my editors, like maybe we don't need this. But I had her go ahead and answer some of the questions for me, just in case I had to put it in. But I successfully convinced them to run the story without having anything in it about, in fact, except for the gendered pronouns, there was nothing in the story to indicate that she was a woman. You know, like that was not what the story was about. It was about, I said, I want to write exactly the same story about Michelle McLaren that I would write about any other, about a male director. Because I feel like that's the only way that you can move the ball forward. And I think, I was thinking in the plane also about casting. You know, I talked about this a minute ago, but there was a show called Hill Street Blues that aired when I was younger.
I remember that.
A great show. And there was a character, and I you know, I don't want to be rude, so I'm not going to take out my cell phone and try to look up the actor's name. But there was a guy on the show. He was a defense attorney who was in a wheelchair. He was a recurring character on the show who was in a wheelchair. And I first saw the show when I was a kid. And I remember that this guy goes into court, he has to be defended, and the lawyer shows up, and he's a guy in a wheelchair. He's probably in his 30s, and he defends him. And I was thinking, like, we're going to find out why he's in the wheelchair, and we never. And then we see him again a few episodes later. He's defending somebody else. I'm like, this must be the episode where he found out how he ended up in the wheelchair, and we don't.
Because that's not,
And we
yeah.
don't. And I was a kid, and I'm telling you, this blew my mind because TV shows at the time didn't do that. And from
Yeah.
If you see a character in a wheelchair, you say, soon we'll get the story of how they ended up in a wheelchair, and there will be a very special episode about how bitter they are that they're in a wheelchair. And, you know, wouldn't it be really amazing if most television shows or movies didn't do that?
Yes. Don't spoon feed people. Don't.
Yeah.
Let me make up a backstory. I mean,
Yeah.
don't tell me how I became black. Because I mean, 'cause I was born that way. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
But how do you, you talked about the character on Hill Street Blues, and as someone who was an undergraduate here, I lived in Weston Hall, and on the ground floor of Weston Hall was where the disabled students lived. And for the first time in my life, I got that interaction with people who had something happen to them, and they were dealing with it. But what I found fascinating was that I became more accepting through that engagement. What led them to the wheelchair became less and less interesting as I went on, but I also had to deal with the real fear because their chairs reminded me that my body could be broken.
Yes.
And so moving past that, seeing the chairs in was a real difficult thing. And you talk about film and television sort of spoon feeding. What happens when they get it wrong? Where you as the professionals, people come in and said, "Oh, I saw this, and now I think I understand what the issue is." And you're like, "Oh, wait a minute."
How
Yeah.
things actually work is a huge part of it. You know, just showing you how the world works. If you're a different kind of person, if there are some descriptors that are different from the default. Like again, to use a character in a wheelchair as an example, Born on the 4th of July was shown here at last year's festival. One of my very favorite films. And there's a shot in that movie that is just such a great. It's one of my favorite shots in the whole movie. Tom Cruise's character, Ron Kovic, the disabled war vet, has gone to see his old high school sweetheart at her university, and she says, we're having a meeting to discuss the war. Do you want to come with me? I'm going there right now. And he says, that sounds great. And she's about to go up the steps to go into this thing, and there's a shot of his feet, the camera's at the level of his feet in the wheelchair, and he glides towards the curb and it bangs into the curb, and the camera pans up to his face, and he goes, you know what, I'll catch up with you later. And something you don't see all the time. And I actually think about that a lot of times when I'm in buildings. I think, like, if I were in a wheelchair, would I be able to get into this building? That's not something that I myself have to think about all the time, but somebody in a wheelchair would. Anyway, I don't know why I'm so obsessed with that right now, but
I think this idea of getting things right is interesting because is it that the film is reflecting reality of one kind or of another kind? So the girl with the tiny waist reflecting a certain reality that's happening in the media and to young women. So in some ways, the films always get it right because they're showing us a piece of something we may not want to see. And that's why I think a review, it has to be so much more than an opinion. It needs to go there. So in some ways, art always gets it right because it's reflecting something back at us. We need to be able to see, oh gosh, we're obsessed with thinness, or gosh, we're obsessed with whiteness or straightness. And that makes, so there's no wrong in some way.
Okay.
And I know what you're saying, like, oh, it's not reality. This is reality. It's just showing us reality in a different way.
Yeah. And when I get to go into some mental health issues, I mean, and when they're, I can't even come up with a name of a movie right now, but when a student sees it and comes in and wants to have that conversation, they say, well, you know, the autism is way more than what they just showed, or schizophrenia is way more than,
Oh, that's the next
Yeah.
frontier.
yeah,
That's the next frontier of language and criticism is mental health.
yeah.
And in fact, I complain about this I'm on Twitter, and I sometimes will complain about this. This is something that headline writers are now very sensitive about almost everything except mental health, and they still use words like insane and crazy when they mean awesome or interesting. They'll say this new trailer for such and such a movie is insane. And this is something like, until I had a good friend who struggled with mental health issues and was on a number of different kinds of medication for it. And I remember one time I said to her, I don't remember the context, but she said something, and I said, don't be crazy. And her face fell, and I had no idea that she was on all these different medications to control these issues. And she told me about it, and I said, oh, okay, well, I'm never going to say that again, like when I'm around her. But I didn't think it was offensive. I didn't think it was offensive. And offensive is such a loaded word, because people are like, oh, you're offended, like you're, I don't know, like you're just trying to make trouble for everybody else. In the sense of giving offense, like it's a verbal equivalent of a slap, that when you don't expect to be slapped,
And it compartmentalizes, marginalizes, puts you in a little
Yeah.
box. There's no way out of it.
Yeah, insane and crazy is that's a slur, actually. And I didn't used to think of it as a slur, and now I'm trying to think of it that way. There's other words.
Oh, yeah, there are lots
Well, I
of
think
words.
some of
other
the
words.
issues that we're talking about too, just outside of criticism, is it's a much huger. We were talking about, seeing the guy in the wheelchair. The issue of, I have a bunch of friends who are casting directors, and some of them are for like commercials, which is the most traditional. It's literally types. We need a brunette, hot guy with a six-pack, and sometimes they try to sneak in, people who don't fit. And some of the success stories are it's like bedtime stories. I'm like, tell me that story about Cameron Manheim again. Like because Cameron Manheim was this amazing actress who was not getting cast because she was fat. And she would say it herself, and she wrote a one-woman show called Hi There, I'm Fat, or I Woke Up This Morning. And it got these rave reviews at the public, and everyone loved her, but no, she couldn't get on television. And my friend who was the casting director had a mechanic who had to come. It was like an auto oil, and they snuck her in it was all men who look exactly like mechanics, and she booked it. I mean, it was her first national, and it sounds so small, but it chips away at what you expect, and there can be like, oh my gosh, so like a big person could look at and go, oh my God, on television, and she's not a loser. She's like this awesome from under a car. I don't know. I'm too optimistic, but I think those moments where you're not making a point about the appearance that can make you go, oh, maybe it challenges you if you have those feelings. And I hope that, you can welcome being challenged, going, oh, okay, I have a little bit of a story about someone who looks like that. And that's my issue. I mean, it's hard because we all know how people just attack, but anyway.
Yeah, this conversation has me thinking about these two different types of invisibility. One type of invisibility, going back to Ralph Ellison, is where you don't acknowledge that someone exists. You don't want to acknowledge that they exist, right? You push them away, right? And then there's the other type, which is, okay, I'm visible, but those are not the parts of me that you need to focus on, right? What's really striking about our conversation.
Right. like, we don't want that from you. We like that you're here. I mean, I think people like Melissa McCarthy are challenging that. I mean, she's like in a poster with a gun she's an action hero last summer. I was like, this is the best.
She's like a Mel Gibson character.
She is.
A lot of times, she's like the crazy one who gets the job done.
And she gets to be like the smartest
There's
one
that
in the
word
room.
again.
And she gets,
By which you meant Boston.
Yeah,
you know, and she gets to be obnoxious. She's not always
it's
a
an
hero.
ongoing process. Yeah.
Anyway, those moments, yeah.
So what I wanted to do was to ask you to comment on girlhood specifically in terms of as a critic and how it deals with some of these issues. Giving spoilers, okay?
They all die at the end.
And then while they do that, you can go ahead and line up if you have questions for the group. Okay, so start with Sheila.
Well, we were beforehand about it, that, you know, you're in the world of these four girls, and what, from my experience, and I've seen it a couple times, is maybe because I've seen certain types of movies where girlhood is treated in a certain way, and it kind of doesn't go down that way. It's like these forks that I enjoy, these moments where you go, okay, what? And then the screen goes to black, and then they come back and they're in a different place, which is how we experience life in many ways, but it's not shown, especially with girls who can be very marginalized. It's all about the sex, it's all about them. We get to see, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful experience. It's not particularly optimistic at times. At times it's, you feel worried for them, but that for me was the real revelation of the film. I was like, oh my God, girlhood without the stuff that normally comes around it. And so that's my take.
I have to be joining along with all the rest of us.
Oh. It was, for me, I'm not a movie critic, I'm a fan. It was very intimate in that there were times that felt like a documentary, which it wasn't. It had that gritty documentary feel. And other times, there were these, you know, the way she did the film, it was very like fantasy, the way she did. So I think it really is a great movie for engaging dialogue because it is like an onion. It has just layers and layers and layers of storytelling and decision-making and double binds, while being kind of gritty and real feeling.
I've not seen much of it either. However, I mean, from what I'm hearing, I mean, something that I also teach a human sexuality class, and I think from what I'm hearing, it's something that could work in that classroom or in the women's studies class, and I do some work with a women's studies teacher also.
And her other two films as well, Water Lilies and Tomboy, have similar examinations of different aspects of girlhood and sexuality, all young, like teens, tweens, and it's important stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely something to see.
Matt, you got?
No, I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, all right. Good. Go ahead, we'll take the first question.
I'm on the panel with Eric and Sheila tomorrow, and I've been reading up on a lot of interviews with the director, Celine Sciamma, in preparation for it, and she's been talking a lot about how she's come under fire with a lot of people for making a film about young black women when she herself is a white woman. And a lot of people had told her, you know, you really would have solved all the problems if you had just made a film about a white woman, Asian woman being friends.
They walk into a bar.
And she said, well, that's just, that's the superficial idea of diversity. But it's if you just have everyone represented, you're representing no one. And she's like, I wanted to be very specific. I would just like to hear your thoughts on this, because there's many different types of controversy like that, of people like, well, why aren't you making a film about your type of, you know, your race?
Can I just before we get into that, can I tell you my favorite joke of all time?
Yeah.
A priest, a rabbi, a nun, a dog, a cat, and a horse walk into a bar, and the bartender says, "What is this, a joke?"
I would take that.
I think the response to that is not about her, it's about a condition within filmmaking. That circumstance only becomes an issue because women of color are not being allowed to tell their stories. So when someone who's not them tells their story, they draw this attention to themselves, and she has every right to tell that story. That's not what I'm saying. But what people are responding to, I think, is not heard. They're responding to the condition that filmmakers of color find themselves in. So.
Well, I think it's also a beautiful example of a double bind, because if people of color are left to always speak up for their own stories, that can be very inducing. Like, why are we always the spokespeople? If a Muslim man goes on television and starts to talk about the Christian Bible, it becomes this double bind. Well, what does he know about the Christian Bible?
Oh, yeah.
But I'm a professor of religious studies.
Right.
Am I
Yeah.
Muslim?
Never done that.
Right? So it's the same double bind, right?
That's-
Why can't I tell the story about these girls? Because, so it's like this about whatever her movie's about.
That's what I was saying earlier. Like, I watch a fair amount of TV news, and I tell you, almost every single time, and I'm with my daughter who's going into college and is really into. She became politically active, and now she's in television news like my grandpa used to do. The damn government! She's like 17. But sometimes we'll be watching TV news, and I'll see an African American on when I walk in. Go, this segment is about the plight of the black American, and I'm the black man usually.
Let's just call it
Yes, and I'm almost always right, and it's like I want to see. Just once I want to turn on Fox News Channel and see 3 people of color discussing now. Because I'm sure you could get people like that on that panel if you wanted to, but nobody thinks to.
Going back to people of color discussing NASCAR. Brad Doherty, who used to be a center for, I can't remember what team, he's a black guy. He owns a NASCAR team. However, very few people actually even know that because they never bring him on.
I remember Vernon Reid, the guitarist for In Living Color, at some point in the 80s, he issued this press release, and he said, from henceforth, African-American hard rock group, he said, henceforth, nobody involved with this band will ever again answer a question about what it's like to be a black man who plays heavy metal music.
Yeah,
Yeah.
done.
He was done. It's like asked and answered.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hi, everyone. I apologize for looking off my phone. I had a lot of things to organize. But Matt, I appreciated you talking about in that article, because it's like when the woman is asked, how do you handle being a female director and being a mother? And it's like, well, men can be fathers too. You have a responsibility to your kids. So I appreciate that you didn't want to focus on that. So you guys were talking about the difference between boyhood and girlhood and comparing those. And there's been a lot of attention given lately to how, like, look at this, female leads can bring in money to film and female directors can make successful films. And we get, Hunger Games, Divergent, even the recent success of Cinderella, which then became a focus on Lily James's waist size and what she did to make her waist that small, and was it CGI? And it was like, that like frustration. But now there are programs coming up in LA, like AFI and things, for women directors. Like, here's a program. If you want to be a director, you can apply. If you want to be a female director, you can apply and be in this program. And I wonder if you find those programs to be successful or only hurting the message of women in this industry, because who wants to be a director, I'm like, yay, somewhere I have a chance to get in, but what message is that really sending?
Wow, that's quite a question.
Huge question.
It's like that anecdote I was telling you about my friend James By, that, do you put Asian Americans in your science fiction film and suddenly everybody thinks it's a movie about being Asian American? Or do you cast white people and you get criticized by the community for whitewashing a film that could be multicultural? I don't know. But sometimes, forms of what used to be called affirmative action, that's such a loaded word now, are necessary, because what else are you gonna do? I don't know what else to do.
Well, and there's ways in which, so this question of ghettoizing versus support, right? So when a group is marginalized and it has trouble getting into a mainstream something, women in science fiction is another example. I mean, there's lots of examples. It's this tension between sometimes that group needs some extra support because they're way behind for discriminatory reasons. And if you sort of ghettoize, these are women directors, they're not as serious, they're women soccer players, they're not as interesting to watch, they're not going to sell as many tickets. Well, or basketball players. Yeah, it's a real tension in the world of trying to minimize gaps of discipline and academic achievement in schools. And I think back and forth in trying to support groups and give them a step up, and overdoing it, and it becomes ghettoized. It's probably not very helpful to the young lady who's asking you.
I think at the end of the day, we're saying we don't have a fix-it, right? It's what doors can we open, albeit small. Yeah.
There was a story,
and also-
I'm sorry, related to that, there was a story online that I read, I think just yesterday or the day before, about how if you sort of factor in the number, you sort of average out all the different jobs that are available in film and television over the years, there hasn't been that much progress in terms of making directing a less white and male profession. And that a lot of studios have responded to these mandates from the Directors Guild to increase the number of women, increase the number of directors of color by double counting. Like when, if you, on that rare occasion when you get, say, a black woman directing an episode of a television show, the studio will say, well, we've taken care of the woman quotient and the African American quotient. This is actually a real thing. They actually do that. They're double counting, and it's like, and then they can hire more white guys. And I don't think that a lot of them, and this probably makes it even worse, but they don't even think of it as a particularly insidious thing. Like, hey, great, it's a twofer.
And if you're lucky, she's gay.
Yeah,
It's a 3 for.
Yeah, it's a trifecta.
Oh.
and sometimes if you tell really interesting stories, somehow you get past that. So the fact that a film like Su Nombre, which is about sort of South American gangs, is directed by someone who's Asian. But no one ever talks about that because the film stands on its own, as no one would sort of look at True Detectives and sort of have a conversation about the Asianness of the director.
I was just about to mention that. I love that.
Yeah, and
This is a totally redneck story too.
Yes, it is. So it's so sometimes if the attention is on the work, then maybe you get past some of that. But I don't know. It's like the answer to the first question. It's about a system and not necessarily about the competency of women as filmmakers. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think that we approach all art with a kind of a filter system. And, it depends. Like my filter comes from my advocacy for people who live with mental illness. That's why I'm here today. I serve on the board of NAMI Illinois, National Alliance on Mental Illness for Illinois. And I have also been affiliate president here. So I noticed when Omar, I believe it was Omar, said something about that we are a society, a culture that's a guilt culture. Yeah. I would say, yes, that's true, but from my filter, we're also a shame culture.
Yeah, we're shaming.
Because there's so much shame. That's why we have stigma. Yeah. Because, we are shamed by the fact that maybe our family member has a brain disorder.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely correct.
No different from diabetes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so that's something that I wanted to bring up. And then also something that Matt said about the language part of how do you deal with the various diversity in their culture and make language less offensive. And just this morning, Dear Abby, bless her heart. I read Dear Abby all the time. She's great. But she was talking about someone who might be unstable and called her a wingnut. And that struck me poorly. And I was contemplating, should I write Dear Abby? She's not, I don't think probably not a mean bone in her body, but that was offensive to me. And so, our filter, like rear their heads at the oddest moments. Any comments?
The comment I would make would be, people of color, we don't want to be identified as crazy. Mm-hmm. So, dealing with young men who come in. A lot of times, they don't want anyone to know because they are not crazy. And trying to have that conversation that this is about whatever it is, adjustments, things like that. It is seen as a bad thing within the community. Latino men, you cannot be seen as weak if you go into counseling. Black men, you cannot be seen as weak if you go to counseling. The Asian, there's a lot of shame with it. I mean, I have dealt with a lot of Asian women also who have a lot of shame attached to not being able to cope with some of just, it's okay. However, there's that struggle. There was that struggle of saying, I don't want anybody to know that I'm talking to you about this. They said, well, okay, just bring your books in and we'll talk about it like it's school.
I've written a little bit about this, and it was actually after Robin Williams' suicide. I wrote about this, but I have struggled with very, very severe depression, particularly over the last 10 years, and you wouldn't necessarily know it from meeting me for the first time, but it's a fact, and like my baseline is not, tiptoeing, like skipping through the daisies. That's not my baseline. My baseline is something that's a lot, lower down than that. And I was talking to a good friend of mine who also is dealing with depression, and he was apologizing every other thing he said for, I'm so sorry that I'm talking to you about that I can't do this or can't do that. And I said, you got to stop thinking about it this way, because society conditioned me, and it's conditioning you, and it's conditioning everybody to think of mental issues as in terms of being something shameful or stigmatized that you can't talk about. And it is no different than if you had been born with, you're missing a foot or something like that. Like, this is something you were born with. It's a part of you. It is a physical condition. It is a chemical condition, and you are not to blame for it. It is something you have to manage. It's something you have to manage, just like you have to manage anything else.
I mean, the first time I was on this panel was because my brother had committed suicide three months prior to the Ebertfest. And the stigma, this was a man who was in this community. He owned Gabe's Place Apartments, was owned by my brother. And he owned quite a bit of apartments in this town on this campus. He still, however, was dealing with major issues of depression. And he found it hard to come to that place to have that conversation with a lot of people about it. And he took his life. He took his life. This was a very successful man by all American standards. He had the money, he had the family, he had the Hummer and whatever. He had all those accoutrements of wealth, but he was depressed.
Thank you for sharing.
This is such a great point, because the flip side of dignity and hope is shame. And I think the movie has several important turning points and forks in where the actions of the girls are actually guided by shame. And it really shows, and it speaks to what you guys are talking about, like how the family, the community, and the other boys in the neighborhood contributed to shaming rather than dignity and hope. And that guides young people's decisions, and that guides adult decisions. So each of us holds a responsibility. That's
Shame.
That's why the Alliance, that's one of the roles Alliance is trying to play, is that this is a life, this can be life and death. When we reflect people back to themselves as not worthy, and not as worthy as the rest of us, and also that it's not okay to talk about certain things, then you kill dignity and hope. And with that, it could be a life-taking thing.
I think as much as we're beginning to accept mental health as a real concern, I think we still regard it as an anomaly when we speak of illness, right? No one speaks of heart condition as an anomaly, or no one speaks of cancer as an anomaly. A point that I have to make very often to the students that visit me is that mental health is just as serious and just as mundane as physical health. Meaning,
The landscape of the human mind is so vast that you don't solve your problems. Like, there's this thing, like, I get so angry about this. The way that therapy has traditionally been portrayed in the media is as a case where you have a specific problem and then you go to therapy, and the therapist helps you figure out what the root of that problem is, and then you find the magic key and you unlock it, and then you're fine.
Yeah.
And that's not what it's like. And I liken it to, you know, I've never visited the continent of Asia before, and then you visit it, and you come back a week later, and somebody's like, "How was Asia?" And you're like, "Great." I know everything there is to know about it. Like, that's your subconscious, is like it's a frickin' continent.
Yeah.
You could clone yourself 10,000 times and never learn everything there is to do things.
Here.
You know?
And of course, beyond mental health, because, you know, every decade there's a new frontier, and, you know, people who believe that they're a man when they're really a woman, the issue of transgendered. And in the movie, a girl who makes certain choices and how she's shamed for that. We're equal opportunity shamers. And that all of that has consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm teaching human sexuality, comes out a lot. I mean, a lot of times with my class, I mean, the first few weeks, I want to get people really having that conversation about that sexuality is not a black and white issue. There are so many different definitions of gender and sexuality that you just don't put it in a box and say, this is it, and this is always what it will be. It's not. I know you've been waiting for a while.
We'll take these last two questions, and we got a break for the other panel. Sir, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I want to make a positive statement, in regard to some of the things you've said earlier, and then a quick question afterwards. My statement is, as an educator for many, many years, and using film in the classroom, quick example to back up what I'm saying. I find most people, overwhelming number, can watch a film and identify with those characters in the film, regardless of the transgender, racial, whatever the situation is. And one film I found interesting in an area where people didn't accept immigrants, the film was El Norte. And we wrote about it afterwards. And I can tell you, in grading those essays on a weekend, almost everyone sided with those two Guatemalan characters. And it was amazing. I don't want to go into the other films, but my quick question for all of you, whoever wants to answer, what are we doing to get these films out there so our young people can focus on these issues in the manner that I'm saying? Because young people almost always, whatever it is that they feel, they think, watching the power and emotion of film just seems to sway them. I gotta have those two win out, and what are we doing? That's all.
I think the most important thing, and I don't teach full-time, but I guest teach a lot of classes and give lectures and things like that. And one thing that I try to do when I present a film where the entire intention is to get somebody to see through the eyes of somebody who's not like them superficially, I try not to frame it in those terms. I try to be sneaky about it. And one of the best vehicles I found is genre films. Like, if you show somebody a film that is, if you say this is a film, I want to show you a film, an immigrant from one country who comes to the States and struggles to assimilate and become an example of all the values that the dominant culture prizes, but in the process becomes alienated from his true nature and corrupted, blah, 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 blah. All these things are true, but the movie is Scarface. And you can have discussions about all those issues after showing your students Scarface. I would totally do that. And in fact, if you walk down the streets of New York, you see T-shirts with Tony Montana's picture on it, and people of all races are wearing those shirts. Like that movie speaks to disreputable film. It's still a disreputable film. Anyway, that's one way, but there's a million other ways, I'm sure, that are better than that. But that's my way.
I'll give you the last question.
Yes, thank you for all of your voices and the insights that you've shared. We often talk about art as a tool for understanding things like stigma, as a tool for even claiming human rights. I wanted to know your comments about thinking about art even, or the development of the ability to create art as a right, or the power of that, the empowerment force of that, and also with all the neurological work that's being done in terms of art capability and what have you. There's a lot on the table in terms of policy and possibility. We'd just like to hear ideas about the development of art capability, filmmaking capability, music making capability. Thank you.
Well, I mean, one thing I appreciate about our contemporary era that we didn't have back when, for example, Matt and I were in college is that with modern technology, everybody can make a movie now, right? And depending upon how net neutrality goes, anyone can make a movie that other people can see all across the world. And then you're part of the open marketplace of ideas.
So with technology, there's been kind of a democratization of art. However, in our schools, we're not teaching enough of it. I mean, I think it opens young people to so many possibilities, and I think we are spending our money unwisely in education. I mean, I've worked in education from K through college now, and we're not doing enough with art.
It's such a great question, because I think art is the perfect intersection of healing and voice. Right? You can help you heal from trauma and simultaneously change the world. And you know, my personal belief is that we're all creators, that the creator made us to be creators. And it's absolutely one of the most empowering things I think we could do for young people and for people who are struggling, is to help them remember that, or find that, access that part of themselves as an artist.
So I'm gonna pose one last quick question before we go. One film which you feel challenges stigma and helps to move people along, what would that film be?
Oh, dude. Holy cow. I'll sit back and say, I don't know.
I think you should have texted us this question
That would have been good.
All right, you know what? I
I'll give you one.
will leave you to think about it.
Can
and then,
I attempt to answer that?
absolutely.
Big old one. Go ahead.
Which is, again, I think metaphor is one of the best ways to deal with all of these issues. And the place to find metaphor is places like science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And one of my favorite films of all time is The Fly, the David Cronenberg remake of The Fly. That's one of the greatest love stories I've ever seen, because in addition to being a great movie with a lot of gooey special effects and horrible, gross stuff in it, it's also the story about two people who are deeply, deeply, perfectly matched, a man and a woman, and then one of them becomes basically, he starts to change. And you can read it as a story of, you know, she married somebody and now he's got a disease, or he has got cancer, or or one of them is older than the other, and the body, you know, age is taking its toll. Like, there's a million different ways you can interpret that movie. And he is himself, and yet he is something different. And the movie's just painfully honest in dealing with what that means when you're on either side of that fence in a relationship. And many of my favorite movies that deal with all of these issues we're talking about today are horror films, science fiction films, and so forth. Deus Ex Machina, which is in theaters now, is a great example of that. Under the Skin is a great example of that. And I think, like, if you're making a horror film, if it's scary enough or gross enough or interesting looking enough, you can deal with anything you want to in terms of metaphor, and people will go see it. And I think that's the way forward is genre. Then you don't have to worry about the color, anything else of your protagonist, as long as you're, you know, giving people a good time. You can sneak all kinds of things in.
All right, Matt, you have the last word. Thank you very much for